Module 2. Types of criminal defenses. Alibi defense. The defendant asserts that they were not present at the scene of the crime when it occurred and can provide evidence or witnesses to corroborate their claim. The alibi defense is a legal defense strategy used by a defendant in a criminal trial to claim that they were not present at the scene of the alleged crime when it occurred. An alibi is evidence that, if proven credible, would show that the accused could not have committed the offense because they were somewhere else at the time the crime took place. To use the alibi defense effectively, the defendant and their legal team typically gather and present evidence that supports their claim of being elsewhere during the commission of the crime. Such evidence may include witness testimonies, providing statements from individuals who can attest to the defendant's presence at a different location at the time of the crime. These witnesses may include friends, family members, colleagues, or other individuals who can vouch for the defendant's whereabouts. Receipts or transactions. Presenting receipts, credit card transactions, or other records showing the defendant's presence at a specific location, such as a store or restaurant, during the time of the alleged crime. Cell phone records. Mobile phone records could be used to establish the defendant's location based on calls, texts, or data activity during the relevant period. Travel records. If the defendant traveled during the time of the crime, documents like flight tickets, boarding passes, or hotel records could be used to support their alibi. It is important to note that the burden of proof for establishing an alibi defense rests with the defendant's legal team. The defense must present enough credible evidence to raise reasonable doubt in the minds of the judge or jury regarding the defendant's presence at the crime scene. Prosecutors, on the other hand, will attempt to challenge the alibi by examining the evidence presented and trying to find inconsistencies or weaknesses. They may cross-examine alibi witnesses, check the credibility of provided documents, or introduce their own evidence to dispute the alibi claim. If the alibi defense is successful and the court finds the alibi evidence to be sufficiently compelling, it may result in the defendant's acquittal. However, if the alibi is not accepted, the trial will proceed, and other defenses or arguments may be presented by the defense team. Self-defense. The defendant argues that their actions were necessary to protect themselves from imminent harm or danger. Self-defense is a legal doctrine that allows an individual to use reasonable force to protect themselves from harm or the threat of harm. It is a fundamental right recognized in many legal systems around the world, permitting a person to act in their own defense without facing criminal liability or legal consequences under certain circumstances. The key principles of self-defense typically include imminent threat. Self-defense generally applies when a person faces an imminent threat of unlawful force or violence. The threat must be immediate and real, and there must be a genuine fear of harm or death. The individual must reasonably believe that they are in danger. Proportional response. The force used in self-defense must be proportionate to the threat faced. This means that the level of force used to defend oneself should not exceed what is reasonably necessary to counter the threat. In other words, using deadly force in response to a non-lethal threat may not be considered justifiable. No duty to retreat. In some jurisdictions, self-defense laws include a stand your ground principle, which means that individuals have no legal obligation to retreat from a threatening situation before using force to defend themselves. They can stand their ground and respond to the threat with force if necessary. Reasonable belief. The individual's belief that they are in danger and need to use force for self-defense must be reasonable under the circumstances. If a reasonable person in the same situation would have felt similarly threatened and acted in self-defense, the defense may be valid. No aggressor. Generally, the person claiming self-defense must not be the initial aggressor or provoke the situation leading to the threat. If the person contributed to the escalation of the conflict, self-defense may not apply. It's important to note that the application of self-defense can vary depending on the specific laws and regulations of each jurisdiction. The interpretation of self-defense in a court of law often involves an assessment of the facts and circumstances of the case, including the threat faced, the actions taken by the individual claiming self-defense, and whether they acted reasonably. It is also worth mentioning that while self-defense can be a valid legal defense against criminal charges, it is not a blanket justification for all actions taken in a confrontational situation. Misuse of self-defense claims or excessive force can lead to legal consequences. As with any legal issue, It is essential to consult with a qualified legal professional to understand how self-defense laws apply in a particular jurisdiction and situation. Insanity defense. The defendant claims they were mentally impaired at the time of the crime and, therefore, lacked the capacity to understand the wrongfulness of their actions. The insanity defense is a legal strategy used by some defendants in criminal trials to argue that they should not be held criminally responsible for their actions due to their mental state at the time the offense was committed. It is based on the principle that individuals who are mentally incapacitated are mentally ill to the extent that they cannot understand the wrongfulness of their actions should not be held fully accountable for their criminal behavior. The key points of the insanity defense typically include mental incapacity. The defendant must demonstrate that they were suffering from a mental disorder or defect at the time of the crime. This disorder must have significantly impaired their ability to understand the nature and quality of their actions or to distinguish right from wrong. Legal standards. Different jurisdictions may have different legal standards for insanity. Commonly used standards include the Monadnock Rule and the Model Penal Code, MPC, standard. The Monadnock Rule focuses on whether the defendant knew the nature and quality of their actions and whether they knew it was wrong. The MPC standard considers whether the defendant lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of their conduct or conform their behavior to the law. Burden of proof. The burden of proving insanity typically rests with the defendant. They or their legal team must present sufficient evidence to convince the court or jury that the defendant meets the legal criteria for insanity. Verdict and consequences. If the insanity defense is successful, the defendant is usually found not guilty by reason of insanity, NGRI. Instead of being convicted of the crime, they may be confined to a mental health facility for treatment and evaluation. The purpose of this confinement is both to protect society and to provide treatment for the defendant's mental condition. Public perception. The insanity defense is a controversial issue, and its use in high-profile cases can sometimes lead to public debate about the fairness and effectiveness of the defense. Some argue that it may be used to exploit loopholes in the legal system, while others believe it is an essential protection for those with severe mental illnesses who lack the capacity to control their actions. It's important to note that the insanity defense is rarely used, and it is not a guaranteed strategy for acquittal. Courts are cautious in their consideration of insanity claims and require substantial evidence to support the defense. In some cases, defendants may be found guilty despite presenting an insanity defense if the court does not find their mental state at the time of the offense to meet the legal criteria for insanity. Intoxication defense. The defendant asserts that they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time of the offense and were incapable of forming the required criminal intent. The intoxication defense is a legal strategy used by defendants in criminal trials to argue that they should not be held fully responsible for their actions because they were intoxicated at the time the offense was committed. Intoxication refers to a state of impairment caused by the consumption of alcohol, drugs, or other substances that affected the defendant's mental and physical abilities. It's important to note that the availability and scope of the intoxication defense can vary significantly depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances of the case. In general, there are two main types of intoxication defenses. Voluntary intoxication. This occurs when a defendant willingly consumes alcohol or drugs and subsequently commits a crime while under the influence. In many legal systems, voluntary intoxication is not a valid defense for most crimes. The rationale behind this is that individuals are responsible for their decisions to consume substances voluntarily, and they should be held accountable for any criminal behavior resulting from their choice to become intoxicated. However, in some jurisdictions, voluntary intoxication may be considered as a partial defense to specific crimes, such as murder, where the defendant's state of mind is a crucial element of the offense. In such cases, voluntary intoxication may reduce a murder charge to manslaughter if the intoxication impaired the defendant's ability to form the necessary intent for murder. Involuntary intoxication. This occurs when a defendant becomes intoxicated without their knowledge or against their will, often due to the actions of another person or external factors, e.g., unknowingly consuming a spiked drink. Involuntary intoxication can be a valid defense in some jurisdictions, as it is considered unfair to hold someone responsible for actions committed while under the influence without their consent. The availability and success of an intoxication defense can be complex and depend on various factors, including the jurisdiction, the specific criminal charge, and the strength of the evidence supporting the intoxication claim. In cases where the intoxication defense is allowed, the burden of proof generally falls on the defendant to show that their intoxication significantly impaired their ability to form the necessary criminal intent or that they were not aware of their actions due to involuntary intoxication. It's essential to consult with a qualified legal professional to understand how the intoxication defense applies in a particular jurisdiction and case, as the laws and interpretations can vary significantly. Additionally, the use of an intoxication defense may have limitations and may not result in a complete acquittal but rather a reduction in charges or sentencing. Duress or coercion. The defendant argues that they were forced or coerced into committing the crime against their will. The defense of duress or coercion is a legal strategy used by defendants in criminal trials to argue that they should not be held criminally responsible for their actions because they were forced or compelled to commit the crime under the threat of serious harm or death. In other words, the defendant claims that they were coerced into engaging in unlawful conduct due to the fear of immediate and significant harm if they refused to comply with the demands of another person. Key elements of the duress or coercion defense typically include imminent threat. The defendant must show that they faced an immediate threat of serious bodily harm or death. The threat must be real and credible, such that a reasonable person in the same situation would have been compelled to act in the same way to protect themselves from harm. No reasonable escape. The defense typically requires the defendant to demonstrate that there were no reasonable opportunities for them to escape or avoid the threat without committing the crime. If a safe avenue for escape was available and the defendant failed to take it, the duress defense may not be valid. Proportional response. The defendant's actions in response to the threat must be proportionate. This means that the level of harm inflicted on others as a result of the defendant's criminal conduct should not exceed the harm the defendant sought to avoid. In other words, the defendant should not use excessive force or commit more severe crimes than necessary to protect themselves. No affiliation with aggressor. Generally, the defendant must not have willingly participated in, or contributed to, creating the situation that led to the coercion. If the defendant voluntarily associated themselves with the threatening party or participated in illegal activities that led to the duress situation, the defense may not be valid. It's important to note that the availability and scope of the duress or coercion defense can vary depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances of the case. Some jurisdictions might not recognize the defense for certain serious crimes or may have strict requirements for its application. As with any legal defense, the burden of proof typically falls on the defendant to provide evidence supporting their claim of duress or coercion. They must convince the court or jury that their actions were a result of being forced into the criminal conduct and that they had no other reasonable choice to protect themselves or others from harm. Each case is unique, and the success of the duress or coercion defense depends on the strength of the evidence presented and the application of the law in the particular jurisdiction where the trial takes place. Defendants seeking to use this defense should consult with a qualified legal professional to understand how it may apply to their specific situation. Entrapment. The defendant claims that law enforcement induced them to commit the crime, which they would not have done otherwise. Entrapment is a legal defense that arises when a law enforcement officer or government agent induces or persuades an individual to commit a crime that they would not have otherwise committed. The defense of entrapment is based on the principle that law enforcement should not be allowed to entice or trick individuals into committing unlawful acts and then prosecute them for those acts. Key elements of the entrapment defense typically include inducement. The defendant must show that they were induced or coerced by law enforcement or a government agent to commit the crime. This inducement can involve pressure, persuasion, fraud, flattery, or any other tactic that would prompt an ordinary person to commit the offense. Lack of predisposition. The defendant must also demonstrate that they did not have a pre-existing inclination or disposition to commit the type of crime in question. In other words, if the person was already willing and ready to commit the offense before any contact with law enforcement, the defense of entrapment may not be valid. The application of the entrapment defense can be complex, and it varies depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances of the case. Some important points to consider are: objective test. Some jurisdictions use an objective test to assess whether entrapment occurred. In such cases, the court considers whether the conduct of law enforcement would have induced an ordinary, law-abiding person to commit the crime. Subjective test. Other jurisdictions use a subjective test, which focuses on the defendant's specific state of mind. The court examines whether the defendant was not predisposed to commit the crime and whether law enforcement's actions led to their involvement in the illegal activity. Government involvement. The degree of involvement by law enforcement or government agents in the commission of the crime is a crucial factor in evaluating an entrapment defense. If the government played a significant role in creating and organizing the criminal activity, it may support an entrapment claim. Evidentiary burden. In most cases, the burden of proof for establishing entrapment rests with the defendant. The defendant or their legal team must present sufficient evidence to raise a reasonable doubt about whether they were induced to commit the crime. It is essential to consult with a qualified legal professional if you believe you have a valid entrapment defense. The law surrounding entrapment can be intricate, and the success of this defense depends on the specific facts and legal standards applicable in the jurisdiction where the case is being tried. Necessity defense. The defendant argues that they committed the crime to prevent a greater harm or evil. The necessity defense is a legal principle that allows a defendant to justify their criminal actions by arguing that they had no reasonable alternative but to commit the offense to avoid a greater harm. In other words, the defendant asserts that they committed the crime out of necessity to prevent an imminent and serious danger or harm to themselves or others. The key elements of the necessity defense typically include imminent threat. The defendant must show that they reasonably believe there was an immediate threat of significant harm or danger. This threat could be to their life, physical well-being, or the safety of others. No reasonable alternative. The defense requires the defendant to demonstrate that there were no reasonable alternatives available to avoid the harm other than committing the crime. The situation must have been such that a reasonable person would have believed there was no other viable option to prevent the harm. Proportionality. The defendant's actions must have been proportionate to the harm they sought to prevent. This means that the level of harm caused by the criminal act should not exceed the harm they were trying to avoid. Causation. The defendant must establish a direct causal link between their criminal conduct and the harm they sought to prevent. In other words, it must be evident that the crime committed was the immediate response to the imminent threat. The necessity defense is not universally recognized in all jurisdictions, and its application can be limited. It is typically reserved for situations of extreme and immediate danger where there is no time to seek lawful alternatives. Additionally, the defense may not be available for certain serious crimes or if the defendant contributed to the situation that led to the necessity. Common examples of situations where the necessity defense might be raised include breaking into a building to save someone trapped inside during an emergency, trespassing on private property to escape from a life-threatening situation, stealing food or medication to survive when faced with imminent starvation or severe illness. As with other legal defenses, the burden of proof typically falls on the defendant to present evidence supporting the necessity defense. They must convince the court or jury that the conditions for the defense have been met, and that their actions were justified given the circumstances. The success of the necessity defense can be challenging and depends on various factors, including the strength of the evidence and the laws of the jurisdiction in which the case is being tried. Therefore, individuals considering using the necessity defense should seek the guidance of an experienced legal professional. Statute of limitations. The defense claims that the prosecution has filed charges after the expiration of the statute of limitations, rendering the charges invalid. The statute of limitations is a legal time limit set by law that dictates the maximum period within which legal proceedings can be initiated for a particular offense or civil claim. Once the statute of limitations period expires, the right to bring a lawsuit or prosecute a crime is generally lost, and the defendant or accused cannot be held legally responsible for the past actions. The main purposes of having a statute of limitations are protecting defendants. The statute of limitations ensures that defendants are not exposed to the threat of legal action indefinitely. It promotes fairness and prevents individuals from facing the uncertainty of potential legal claims for an extended period, allowing them to move on with their lives without constant fear of litigation. Preserving evidence and witnesses. As time passes, evidence may deteriorate, memories may fade, and witnesses may become unavailable or unreliable. Setting a time limit encourages plaintiffs or prosecutors to pursue their claims in a timely manner, while evidence and witnesses are still relatively fresh and accessible. Judicial efficiency. Limiting the time frame for legal actions helps courts manage their caseloads more effectively by prioritizing recent cases over older ones. It also encourages parties to resolve disputes promptly, which can lead to more efficient use of judicial resources. The duration of the statute of limitations can vary depending on the nature of the offense or claim and the jurisdiction in which the case is brought. Different types of offenses, such as murder, theft, fraud, personal injury, or breach of contract, may have distinct statute of limitations periods. For criminal cases, the statute of limitations usually begins to run from the date the crime was committed or, in some cases, from the date the crime was discovered. Some serious crimes, like murder or certain sexual offenses, may have no statute of limitations in certain jurisdictions, meaning they can be prosecuted at any time, regardless of how much time has passed since the crime occurred. In civil cases, the statute of limitations typically starts when the cause of action arises. For example, in a personal injury case, the statute of limitations would generally begin on the date of the accident or when the injury was discovered. It's important to be aware of the statute of limitations when considering legal action or defending against potential claims. If a claim is not filed or a criminal charge is not brought within the specified time limit, the right to pursue legal action may be lost. If you are unsure about the applicable statute of limitations in a particular situation, consult with a legal professional who can provide guidance based on the relevant laws and regulations in your jurisdiction. Mistake of fact. The defendant argues that they made an honest and reasonable mistake of fact that led them to commit the crime unknowingly. Mistake of fact is a legal defense that allows a defendant to argue that they should not be held criminally responsible for their actions because they genuinely and reasonably believed certain facts to be true at the time of the alleged offense. In other words, the defendant asserts that they made an honest mistake about a material fact that, had they known the truth, would have prevented them from committing the crime. Key elements of the mistake of fact defense typically include genuine belief. The defendant must show that they honestly believed the mistaken fact to be true. This belief must be based on a reasonable interpretation of the circumstances as they appeared to the defendant at the time of the incident. Reasonable person standard. The defense often requires the court to determine whether a reasonable person in the same situation would have made the same mistake under similar circumstances. If a reasonable person would not have made the same mistake, the defense may not be valid. Materiality. The mistake of fact must be material to the alleged crime. This means that the mistaken belief is relevant to an essential element of the offense and would have a significant impact on whether the defendant should be held criminally liable. The application and success of the mistake of fact defense can vary depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances of the case. Some important points to consider are strict liability crimes. In cases involving strict liability offenses, where culpable mental state, intent or knowledge, is not an element of the crime, the mistake of fact defense is often not available. In such cases, the defendant's honest belief or lack of awareness is generally not considered a valid defense. Specific intent crimes. The defense is more likely to be successful in cases where the crime requires a specific intent. For example, if a defendant honestly and reasonably believed they had permission to take an item, which they later discovered was stolen, it may be relevant in a specific intent theft case. Mistake versus ignorance of the law. Mistake of fact is distinct from ignorance of the law. Ignorance of the law is generally not a valid defense. In other words, claiming that one did not know the law or was unaware that their actions were criminal is typically not a sufficient defense. As with any legal defense, the burden of proof typically falls on the defendant to present evidence supporting the mistake of fact defense. They must convince the court or jury that their mistaken belief was genuine, reasonable, and material to the alleged crime. Defendants considering using the mistake of fact defense should consult with a qualified legal professional. The success of this defense depends on the specific facts and legal standards applicable in the jurisdiction where the case is being tried. Consent. The defense asserts that the alleged victim gave consent to the defendant's actions, making them lawful. Consent is a crucial legal concept that refers to a person's voluntary and informed agreement to a particular action, decision, or activity. In various areas of law, consent plays a vital role in determining the legality and permissibility of certain actions, particularly those that involve personal rights, bodily integrity, and privacy. Key aspects of consent include voluntary. Consent must be given willingly and without coercion or duress. A person's decision to give consent should be free from any external pressures or threats that could undermine their ability to make an independent choice. Informed. For consent to be valid, the person giving consent must have a reasonable understanding of the nature, purpose, and potential consequences of the action or activity to which they are consenting. Informed consent means that the individual is aware of what they are agreeing to and can make an informed decision based on that knowledge. Capacity. Consent is valid only if the person giving it has the legal capacity to do so. This means they must be of sound mind and old enough to understand the implications of their decision. Certain individuals, such as minors or individuals with mental incapacities, may have limited capacity to give consent, depending on the laws in their jurisdiction. Consent is relevant in various areas of law, including criminal law. Consent is often a critical element in determining whether certain acts are considered criminal offenses. For example, sexual offenses like rape or sexual assault may involve issues of consent. If one party does not consent to a sexual act or is unable to give consent due to intoxication or incapacity, it may be considered a criminal offense. Medical law. In medical contexts, informed consent is essential before performing medical procedures, treatments, or surgeries. Medical professionals must ensure that patients fully understand the risks, benefits, and alternatives to a medical intervention before obtaining their consent. Contract law. In contract law, consent is a fundamental requirement for the formation of a legally binding contract. Parties must voluntarily and knowingly agree to the terms of the contract to create a valid and enforceable agreement. Privacy and data protection. Consent is often a basis for collecting and processing personal data in compliance with privacy and data protection laws. Individuals must provide explicit consent for their personal information to be used or shared in specific ways by organizations or entities. It is essential to understand that consent can be withdrawn at any time, and a person may revoke their consent if they no longer wish to participate in the activity or allow a certain action to take place. Additionally, it is crucial for those seeking consent to ensure that the person giving consent is fully aware of their rights and the implications of their agreement. Infancy defense. The defendant, if a minor, may claim that they are too young to be held criminally responsible. The infancy defense, also known as the defense of infancy or infancy doctrine, is a legal principle that acknowledges the limited legal capacity of children or minors to understand the consequences of their actions and, consequently, their diminished criminal responsibility. It is a defense used in criminal cases where a defendant is a child or a minor under the age of majority, which is typically 18 years old in many jurisdictions. The infancy defense is based on the idea that children lack the mental and emotional maturity to fully comprehend the wrongfulness of their actions or to appreciate the criminal nature of their conduct. As a result, they should not be held to the same level of accountability as adults for their criminal behavior. Key points related to the infancy defense include age of criminal responsibility. Each jurisdiction sets a specific age of criminal responsibility, which is the age at which a person can be charged and prosecuted for criminal offenses. Below this age, usually, a child is presumed to lack the capacity to form criminal intent and, therefore, cannot be held criminally responsible for their actions. Juvenile justice system. In many legal systems, offenses committed by minors fall under the jurisdiction of the juvenile justice system. This system is designed to focus on rehabilitation and treatment rather than punishment for young offenders. Transfer to adult court. In certain cases, particularly for serious or violent offenses committed by older minors, there may be a possibility of transferring the case to adult court, where the defendant could be subject to adult criminal penalties. However, such transfers are typically subject to specific criteria and procedures. Legal implications. The application and treatment of the infancy defense can vary from one jurisdiction to another. Some jurisdictions may have a lower age of criminal responsibility or special provisions for handling certain offenses committed by minors. It's important to note that the infancy defense does not mean that children can engage in criminal conduct without any consequences. Instead, the focus is on age-appropriate interventions and rehabilitative measures to address the underlying issues that may have contributed to the delinquent behavior. The overarching goal of the infancy defense and the juvenile justice system is to strike a balance between holding young individuals accountable for their actions and providing them with opportunities for rehabilitation, guidance, and support to reintegrate into society as productive and law-abiding citizens.